In a congressional hearing watched by 12 million people, Jasmine Crockett confronted Tucker Carlson over media lies that fueled national chaos. What started as a free speech debate erupted into a devastating exposé, with leaked emails, secret footage, and a single line that froze the entire chamber. In a room built to protect power, she called it what it was: weaponized deception. Carlson walked out speechless. What did Jasmine Crockett say that broke him and shocked the nation? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The doors to room 2141 opened with a force that silenced even the camera shutters. Jasmine Crockett stepped in, not as a witness, but as a warning. Dressed in midnight blue, her silhouette was sharp, her presence sharper. Clutched tightly in her hands, a thick dossier stamped 300 in red. She didn't glance around the packed chamber. Her eyes went straight to him, Tucker Carlson, lounging at the far end of the table, legs crossed, smirk intact, as if this were just another primetime monologue. The tension in the room tightened like a noose. No whispers, no motion, just breathless anticipation, broadcast live to a fractured nation. Jasmine took her seat slowly, placing the folder on the table with quiet finality. This wasn't just paperwork, it was ammunition. Around them, lawmakers shifted in their seats, but she remained still. The chair of the committee leaned into the mic, his voice low and firm. We are here today to determine whether the media knowingly fueled falsehood and who will be held accountable. Every camera light flickered. Jasmine didn't blink. Tucker adjusted his tie. The stage wasn't set for a debate. It was set for a confrontation decades in the making. And just as the tension settled into a breathless stillness, Jasmine opened the dossier, not with drama, but with the quiet finality of someone who has carried truth long enough to know its weight. The papers made no sound as she turned them. Only her voice broke the silence, and it did so with measured gravity. Exhibit A, she said, holding up a printed email, its blacked-out headers revealing just enough to make the room lean forward. An internal communication from Mr. Tucker Carlson, dated November 9th, 2020, 2 days after the ballot stopped, but long before the lies did. Her eyes didn't leave him. Quote, "Of course it's not real, but people want to hear it. We can't start calling them idiots." A ripple of shock traveled across the room. You could feel the weight of it settle on shoulders, like guilt you thought you'd buried. Reporters turned to each other, some stunned, some already typing. But Jasmine was still, her fingers tightening around the edge of the next page, not from nerves, but from restraint. "Let me repeat that," she said slowly. "It's not real, but people want to hear it." She turned her gaze to the panel, then to the cameras. That's not just cynical. That's calculated deception broadcast to millions, night after night, because truth was less profitable than fear. Carlson shifted for the first time, almost imperceptibly. A slight uncrossing of legs, a stiffened jaw. Jasmine pressed forward, flipping to another message. "Here's another," she said, this time without raising the paper. "He refers to Sidney Powell, the woman who spun some of the most dangerous lies of the 2020 election, as crazy. He then says, but if we don't air her, Newsmax will." The sentence hung in the air like a noose, not because he believed her, not because it served the public, but because a rival network might get more viewers. She let the silence linger, not to build drama, but because truth, when it cuts, deserves space to bleed. Then she spoke, softer but more damning. "Do you understand what that means? Millions of Americans went to bed each night believing they were being robbed, not because they were lied to by foreign agents, but because you, Mr. Carlson, made it your business to sell fear as fact." She looked down, placed the papers neatly on the table, and folded her hands. Her voice never broke, but her words did what they needed to do. "That isn't journalism. That's betrayal wearing a microphone." She turned to face him directly, her tone now intimate, almost mournful. "You had the platform, the trust, the voice, and you used it not to report, but to manipulate, to hold power, not to hold truth. You didn't make a mistake, you made a choice, and millions paid the price for it." Tucker didn't respond. He didn't blink. But the room felt different now. The mask had slipped, and for the first time, so had the silence. But truth, no matter how clearly revealed, rarely goes unchallenged, especially when it threatens to unravel the carefully maintained illusion of authority. Tucker Carlson didn't flinch, not at first. He placed his hands neatly on the table, fingers interlocked, and leaned in with the confidence of a man who has weathered scandals and spun them into stardom. "We weren't deceiving anyone," he said, his voice smooth, steady, almost dismissive. "We were reflecting the anxieties of millions. That's not misinformation. That's representation. There's a difference." His eyes flicked toward the cameras, fully aware that his words would be clipped, edited, reposted within seconds. "You see, unlike some on this panel," he added, letting the pause hang like a trap, "we don't presume to know better than the people. We don't filter their anger through a moral lens. We air it." The implication hung in the room like secondhand smoke, foul but familiar. Jasmine didn't react immediately. She took a breath, the kind that comes from hearing too many men mistake confidence for correctness. When she did speak, her words were measured but deliberate, like stepping across a minefield she'd walked before. "Let me be clear," she said. "What you call airing grievances, I call constructing outrage. What you broadcast wasn't a mirror, it was a match. You didn't reflect anger. You ignited it. And you did it for one reason, because fear sells faster than facts." Her gaze never left his, and for the first time, the room felt like it tilted ever so slightly toward her. "You fed people what they wanted to hear, even when you knew it was false. You made them believe they were victims of a stolen country, and then you watched them act on it. And while they spiraled, you cashed checks." Carlson gave a tight, performative smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "So now you've appointed yourself the guardian of truth?" he said, a trace of sarcasm in his voice. "A politician playing referee for what counts as acceptable outrage. That's comforting. For you, not for the people you claim to serve." Jasmine leaned forward, not to escalate, but to strip away the facade. "No," she replied, her voice lower now, but unmistakably firm. "I'm not a referee. I'm a witness. I've seen what your words did, not from a studio, but from the ground. I've talked to mothers whose children stormed the Capitol because they believed what you told them. I've seen voters turned away from polls, not by law, but by fear you helped create. This isn't about opinion, it's about consequence. And in this room, Mr. Carlson, we deal with consequences." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was earned. It was the silence that falls when entertainment meets accountability and realizes it no longer controls the script. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't just building a legal argument. She was forcing the room, the cameras, and the nation to confront the human wreckage left behind by manufactured outrage. This wasn't about fact checks anymore. It was about grief. And when she stood, her voice was softer than before, but carried the gravity of a funeral bell. "Madam Chair," she said, "I'd like to introduce a citizen witness whose life was irreversibly changed by the broadcast we've discussed today." She turned slightly toward the rear of the chamber. "Mr. Alan Myers, please come forward." The sound of his footsteps, slow, uneven, heavy, cut through the air sharper than any gavel. Alan Myers looked like any ordinary man. Gray slacks, a worn blazer, eyes that had seen too much and slept too little. But the way he held the small photograph in his hand made it instantly clear. This was not just another opinion in the room. This was a father, a man carrying the full weight of a story no one should have to tell. He approached the witness table, adjusted the mic awkwardly, and cleared his throat. "Thank you," he said, eyes down. I'm not someone who usually talks like this, but I have to today." He held up the photo for the panel to see. "This is Jacob, my son, 27 years old, former National Guard. He believed in this country more than anything. He believed in people like you," he said, his eyes locking on to Tucker Carlson. "He didn't miss your show, not once. He trusted you more than he trusted me. You told him, night after night, that his country had been stolen, that his voice didn't matter unless he fought back. And so he did." His voice cracked. "I begged him not to go to D.C. on January 6th. I told him it was dangerous. But he said, 'Tucker says we have to stand up, Dad. If we don't, we lose everything. That was the last thing he said to me before he packed his bag. He reached into his coat and pulled out a crumpled metro ticket. They found this in his pocket, along with a note to his little sister. He died near the west entrance, crushed, alone, and for what? Alan's voice lowered, almost a whisper now. For a lie, not a mistake. A lie he believed because you made it sound like patriotism. He looked directly at Carlson. You never said his name. You probably never knew he existed. But he knew you. He trusted you. And if he hadn't listened to every word you said, I'd still have my son. The room didn't just fall silent. It seemed to stop breathing. The photograph in his hand trembled again before he gently laid it on the witness table, like lowering it into the ground. You didn't pull the trigger, Mr. Carlson, but you loaded the gun. No one moved. No one interrupted. Because how do you argue with a father's loss? Jasmine stayed on her feet, letting the silence linger, not to dramatize, but to respect the truth just spoken. Her eyes welled, but she didn't blink. This was not her pain, but she carried it now, because someone had to, and the man sitting across from her, with all his power and platform, never had. The room was still thick with grief, a silence carved not by fear, but reverence, for the photo still resting on the witness table, for the father who could barely breathe through his own truth. But grief, no matter how raw, rarely stops those skilled in deflection. Power doesn't apologize, it recalibrates. And Tucker Carlson, veteran of 1,000 controversies, knew exactly when to shift from silence to strategy. He hesitated just long enough to appear human. His mouth tightened. His eyes briefly fell to the photo of Jacob, then returned to the room with something colder behind them. What happened to that young man, he began, his voice lower, slower, almost mournful, is heartbreaking. No one, least of all me, wants that. But then came the pivot, clean, practiced. Still, I can't be held responsible for how people choose to act on information. Millions of Americans heard the same broadcasts and didn't do what he did. They didn't storm buildings or clash with police. They asked questions. They sought truth where institutions had failed them. His tone shifted with each sentence, slowly returning to form. If a handful took things too far, twisted the message into something violent, that's not journalism's failure. That's a failure of individual judgment. A tragic one, yes, but not mine. He glanced toward the committee as if inviting them to agree. Extremists exist in every movement. We don't shut down speech because someone misinterprets passion for permission. Then he turned to Jasmine, carefully, knowing the cameras would catch the stare down. You've stood on stages and demanded change. You've challenged systems. You've spoken truths people didn't want to hear. Surely you understand the danger of being blamed for how someone else reacts to your words. The room didn't gasp. It chilled. Because what Tucker had done was familiar. He stepped out of the blast radius without ever admitting the explosion. He wasn't taking responsibility. He was managing optics, painting himself not as the match, but as the misunderstood messenger. But everyone in that chamber, especially Jasmine, knew exactly what he was doing. And this time the truth was watching. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't finished. Not with rhetoric, not with redirection, and certainly not with the myth of lone guilt. What Tucker Carlson tried to frame as an isolated misinterpretation, she was about to expose as a deliberate culture, one that didn't just tolerate hate, but monetized it. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The silence around her did more than enough. Slowly, with both hands, she lifted a heavy-bound transcript from the binder before her. It bore the seal of federal authentication and the initials AG, printed in firm black ink on the corner. Abby Grossberg. Jasmine looked around the room before she spoke. We've heard what Mr. Carlson said in public, she began. Now it's time we hear what was happening when the cameras were off. Her voice was even, but behind each word was a simmering current of fury. Abby Grossberg, senior producer, Fox News. She worked on Mr. Carlson's show for over 2 years, and in her sworn testimony, given under penalty of perjury, she described what she called, quote, a newsroom ruled by fear, sexism, and casual bigotry. She paused for emphasis, then turned a page with surgical precision. She writes, "Women were routinely shut out of editorial decisions. We were interrupted, mocked, and referred to as liabilities if we pushed back. I was told to smile more in meetings and not to question the tone of certain segments, even when they bordered on white nationalist rhetoric." Murmurs rolled through the gallery, but Jasmine didn't stop. She flipped again. On the subject of anti-Semitism, producers made jokes about Jewish billionaires controlling media narratives. I raised concerns, and I was told to lighten up or get reassigned. Her hand trembled slightly, but her voice remained anchored. And here, she added, holding up the page, she describes a work culture where slurs and racial tropes were tossed around with impunity, where the boundaries between commentary and cruelty were deliberately erased for the sake of keeping ratings high and headlines edgy. She placed the transcript on the table with a dull thud, then looked directly at Carlson. This wasn't about chaos. It was about control. You didn't lose the narrative. You authored it. You built a culture where hate could hide in plain sight, cloaked as sarcasm or satire. And you protected it because it worked, for you. Carlson's expression tightened, but he said nothing. Not yet. Jasmine leaned in, quieter now but sharper. You didn't just shape public opinion. You shaped a workplace where cruelty wasn't just tolerated, it was rewarded. The chamber remained breathless. Crockett stood there, not grandstanding, but grounding. She wasn't just reading from a file. She was holding up a mirror and daring the country to look. But when the walls of public accountability begin to close in, the instinct of the powerful is rarely humility, it's deflection. And Tucker Carlson, no stranger to pressure, didn't hesitate to reach for the oldest weapon in his arsenal. Discredit the accuser. He straightened in his seat, his voice sharpening as the air in the room turned electric. Let's not overstate this, he said, each word measured, careful, dripping with controlled contempt. Abby Grossberg is a former employee. She wasn't terminated because of her values or some alleged toxicity. She was terminated because she was no longer effective in her role. That's the truth no one here wants to say out loud. He let the words linger, then leaned forward slightly, just enough to give the impression of candid honesty. What she's offering you now isn't testimony. It's a revenge narrative. And frankly, I think everyone in this room knows it. He gestured loosely toward the transcript on the table, as if it were a prop, not a sworn document. We're living in a culture where personal disappointment becomes performance, where someone loses a job, then reappears months later with a lawsuit, a book deal, and suddenly they're the voice of conscience. He looked directly at Jasmine, as if daring her to object. You know as well as I do, disgruntled people can say anything, especially when they're desperate to be relevant again. His voice didn't rise, but it hardened. Abby wasn't some moral sentinel. She was a producer. She didn't object when the ratings were strong and the paychecks cleared. But now suddenly, she's the heroine in a screenplay she's writing for herself. The words were meant to be cutting, final, but they echoed in the chamber like something else. Fear dressed as confidence. The kind of fear that lashes out when the illusion of control begins to crack. Carlson had reduced sworn allegations of misogyny and anti-Semitism to petty office drama. And as he leaned back with a smirk, it became clear he hadn't discredited Abby Grossberg. He'd exposed his own playbook. Tucker Carlson had tried to do what powerful men have done for generations: reduce a woman's lived experience to a grudge, her testimony to a tantrum, her pain to a performance. But Jasmine Crockett didn't meet that tactic with outrage. She didn't need to. What she wielded instead was something far more unsettling for men like him. Calm, unflinching truth. She didn't look at her notes. She didn't need them. She simply turned her body toward the committee, her voice clear and even, like a surgeon explaining what she was about to cut away. Mr. Carlson, she began, women don't seek attention. They seek justice. They seek to reclaim the voice that was stripped from them by men, by institutions, by the machinery of media that valued ratings over respect. Her words didn't explode. They landed, heavy, measured, honest. You called Abby Grossberg a disgruntled employee. You made her sound petty, small, replaceable. But let me tell you what I see when I read her testimony, she said, lifting the transcript still lying before her. I see a woman who survived a culture that told her to laugh off humiliation, to stay quiet if she wanted to keep her job, to smile while others profited from her silence. Her voice dropped slightly, not for drama, but for control. She didn't come forward for fame. She came forward because there's a limit to how long you can hold poison inside before it begins to rot your soul. She looked directly at Carlson, and for the first time, she didn't just speak to the room. She spoke to the millions watching. You see, when men like you are accused, your first instinct is always the same. Question the credibility of the woman. Dismiss her, diminish her, dehumanize her. Because if you can make the world believe that she is the problem, then you never have to be the solution. She turned back to the committee, but her words still echoed toward him. That's not a defense. That's a pattern, and America's starting to recognize it. There was no applause, no grand gesture, just silence. The kind that fills a space when truth has taken all the oxygen. Jasmine hadn't defended Abby Grossberg. She had reframed her as a symbol of every woman who dared to speak in rooms that weren't designed for her voice. And Tucker Carlson, with all his media power and practiced dismissals, suddenly looked very small in the seat he once owned. But Crockett hadn't come to this hearing to debate abstractions or dissect ideologies. She came with receipts. And this next piece wasn't speculation or testimony or secondhand memory. It was a window, a rare, unfiltered glimpse behind the curtain of performance into the moment when the mask slipped, and the truth, the real truth, revealed itself. Without a word, she lifted a small remote from her folder and turned toward the committee's audiovisual technician. A screen descended from the ceiling, lights dimmed slightly, and the room fell into the kind of hush reserved for verdicts and final breaths. This clip, she said, her voice smooth but steady, was preserved from internal Fox News studio servers. It was recorded immediately after a live segment aired on November 10th, 2020. It has never been made public until now. A timestamp blinked onto the screen. November 10th, 2020, 9:32 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Fox News Control Room, Studio B. The grainy footage showed Tucker Carlson pulling off his earpiece, stretching back in his chair, face flushed from a high-energy segment. He chuckled, then laughed harder, shoulders shaking. That was gold, he said offhandedly to someone just off camera. Dominion should send me a thank you card. We're keeping them relevant. He paused, then added with a smug grin, what do you think? Should we run a segment next week about them being operated from a cave in Venezuela? That'll give the base something to chew on. Laughter followed. Not the nervous kind, but the easy, comfortable laugh of men who knew they were untouchable. The clip ended after just under 30 seconds. No music, no commentary, just raw, unedited reality. The stillness afterward was suffocating. Aides stopped typing. Reporters slowly lowered their phones. The oxygen seemed to thin as people processed what they had just witnessed. It wasn't just a damning soundbite, it was confirmation. This wasn't a man caught off guard. It was a man comfortable with the lie, aware, calculating, and entertained by it. Jasmine let the silence hang, her hands folded in front of her. You just saw a man mocking the very lie he helped sell to millions, she said, her voice low but thunderous in effect. That wasn't satire. That wasn't a joke gone wrong. That was clarity, undeniable clarity, of a person who understood the falsehood and aired it anyway because the audience demanded it and the network rewarded it. She stepped closer to the center of the hearing room. There was no hesitation in that laugh, no doubt, only certainty. The certainty that truth was irrelevant and that he could shape reality as long as the cameras kept rolling and the advertisers kept paying. She turned to face Tucker directly. Mr. Carlson, you've sat here portraying yourself as misunderstood, misquoted, mischaracterized. But that clip, your words, was not filtered through a liberal lens or twisted by a panel. That was you, off air, unmasked, and laughing. The room had no rebuttal, not yet, not from the press, not from the committee, and not from Tucker, because no statement of denial could compete with a moment that spoke for itself. The footage had ended, But the silence it left behind did not. It hung there, dense, charged, unnerving, as if the room itself had to process what it had just witnessed. Tucker Carlson sat motionless at first, his hands resting on the polished wood of the table, fingers twitching slightly as though searching for the weight of control he no longer held. His eyes didn't meet Jasmine's or the committee's. Instead, they drifted toward the floor, then the ceiling, as if looking for a line that might rescue him, a fragment of script that could restore what had been shattered by 30 seconds of undeniable truth. And then, too late and too rehearsed, came the smirk. A cold, practiced thing meant to reassert dominance, but now drained of power. "If this is your witch hunt," he muttered, voice tinged with deflection, "then by all means. Good luck." The words were meant to dismiss, to reframe himself as the victim of a spectacle, not the architect of one. But there was no laughter, not from the audience, not from the press, not even from his own allies on the dais. Because something had shifted. The charm was gone. The sarcasm, once disarming, now read as hollow. And the room, once tolerant of his posture, had lost its patience. Jasmine didn't respond. She didn't need to. The power of that moment wasn't in the counterattack. It was in the stillness. In the way the committee chair looked up without speaking, his pen paused mid-note. In the way the court stenographer slowly resumed typing, her fingers stiff, deliberate, as if aware that she was now recording history, not just testimony. In the way the Republican senator 3 seats down, who had spent the first hour checking his phone, now sat fully upright, eyes locked on Carlson, brow furrowed, not with outrage, but realization. And it was in that silence that the tide turned. Not with a gavel, not with a ruling, but with a shift in gravity. This was no longer just a hearing, it had become a reckoning. And Tucker Carlson, for all his years of controlling the frame, now found himself trapped inside it, exposed, unarmed, and unmistakably alone. But Jasmine Crockett knew this hearing was no longer just about one man or one network. It had become a mirror held up to the soul of American democracy, and she intended to ask the one question that no one at that table could dodge. What is the cost of power when truth is optional? But Jasmine Crockett knew this hearing was no longer just about one man or one network. It had become a mirror held up to the soul of American democracy, and she intended to ask the one question that no one at that table could dodge. What is the cost of power when truth is optional? She placed both palms flat on the table, leaned forward slightly, and allowed her voice to settle into something deeper than anger. Conviction. "We've heard testimony, we've seen footage, we've exposed a pattern," she said slowly, allowing each word to weigh itself down before continuing. "But beneath every segment, every edited headline, every smirk that sold fear disguised as certainty, there's something far more dangerous. A broken contract between democracy and its messengers." She scanned the panel, then turned toward the gallery, as if she were addressing not just the committee, but the country itself. "A free press is not a free-for-all," she continued. "It is one of the few institutions that can either strengthen the foundation of democracy or help unravel it, brick by brick, broadcast by broadcast." Her tone was calm, but each sentence carried the cadence of something meant to last. And when the pursuit of truth is replaced by the pursuit of engagement, when fact is sacrificed for feelings and fear, what remains isn't journalism, it's theater with blood on its hands. Tucker shifted in his seat, recognizing the narrative slipping further from his grasp. He straightened, exhaled sharply, and delivered his counter not with volume, but with polished familiarity. "Congresswoman," he began, "I don't dispute the power of media. I've lived it. I've seen it. But freedom, true freedom, must include the freedom to be wrong. That's what the First Amendment guarantees. Not perfect speech, not state-approved speech, just speech. The marketplace of ideas, as chaotic as it may be, is still the best defense against tyranny." He paused, letting the words hang like a shield. "What you're proposing, demanding moral accountability for every word, every mistake, every misinterpretation, that's not journalism. That's thought control." He leaned in slightly as if delivering a final blow. "The alternative to freedom of expression isn't truth, It's censorship. There was a murmur among the room. Soft, cautious, like people unsure if they were hearing a defense or a warning. Jasmine didn't blink. She let Carlson's words settle, as one might let smoke clear before walking back into the room. Then with a slow, deliberate inhale, she responded. Not to him, but to the logic he represented. No, Mr. Carlson, she said, her voice steady. Freedom of expression is not freedom from consequence, and it is certainly not the freedom to burn the bridge of national trust and walk away unscathed because your contract didn't include a conscience. She stood now, fully, her height adding weight to her next words. You speak of the marketplace of ideas as though truth and falsehood are merely competing brands on a shelf. But you forget that lies, especially when broadcast by those with power, don't just linger. They metastasize, they infect families, they break elections, they turn peaceful citizens into violent mobs. She reached for the Dominion clip again, tapping it lightly with her finger. This wasn't a mistake. It was a strategy. It wasn't misjudgment. It was monetization of mistrust. You didn't get it wrong. You got it lucratively right. Tucker opened his mouth, but she kept going. You see, Mr. Carlson, democracy does not crumble under imperfect speech. It crumbles under calculated distortion. It erodes when people with platforms as vast as yours decide that rage is more profitable than reason, and that consequences are someone else's burden to carry. She turned to the committee once more, locking eyes with members across the aisle. And when that behavior is defended under the banner of freedom, what we are doing is redefining liberty, not as a safeguard of the people, but as a weapon for the powerful. The room was stone still now, the kind of stillness that doesn't come from fatigue, but from realization. Jasmine let the silence breathe, not because she needed time, but because she knew the weight of her next words. Tucker Carlson is not on trial for having an opinion. He is not here because of ideology or politics. He is here because millions of Americans trusted him with the power of their fear, and he sold it back to them at a profit. Her voice dropped lower now, and when the smoke cleared, he called it freedom. She returned to her seat without flourish. The tension in the air remained unbroken. Tucker shifted again, but this time it wasn't strategic. It was defensive. The philosophical ground he had tried to stand on had dissolved under the weight of lived consequences. He had invoked liberty. She had answered with responsibility. And in that contrast, the room had seen the real question emerge. Not can we say anything, but should those with power be allowed to say everything, even when they know it's a lie? The committee chair leaned slightly forward, fingers tented beneath his chin. No gavel dropped. No one rushed to speak. Because what had just happened wasn't procedural. It was tectonic. The foundation had moved, and everyone in the room felt it. But the deeper Jasmine pushed into the roots of media accountability, the more the hearing transformed. Not merely a courtroom of facts, but a reckoning over the soul of a nation. What is America? And who gets to define it when truth is no longer sacred? Jasmine Crockett straightened in her seat, the static from the microphone briefly cracking as she adjusted it. Not to amplify her voice, but to center the silence around it. This is bigger than Mr. Carlson, she began, her tone quiet but unshakable. It's bigger than Dominion, bigger than Fox, bigger than the talking points that have been recycled and regurgitated across screens for years. This hearing, this moment, is about the soul of American democracy and whether we still know how to tell the truth when telling lies is more profitable. A few heads turned, a few pens froze mid-sentence. Jasmine's words didn't just land, they reshaped the air in the chamber. Freedom of speech was never meant to be freedom from accountability, she continued. It was meant to protect dissent, not deception. And there is a difference, a crucial one, between questioning authority and undermining reality itself. Tucker Carlson shifted in his chair. The posture was familiar, casual defiance, arms crossed, lips curled slightly at one side. He leaned forward, voice measured, as if rehearsed 100 times in a green room. You speak as though disagreement is a threat to democracy, he said. But dissent is democracy. That's the America I believe in. Not one where speech is policed and opinion punished, but one where every person, whether right or wrong, has the right to be heard. He paused, letting the words breathe. The Constitution doesn't require us to be correct. It demands we be free. And if we lose that, if we lose the right to be wrong, we lose everything that makes this country what it is. There was a moment where some on the panel nodded reflexively. Carlson was playing to an old trusted rhythm, the defender of the misunderstood, the champion of rugged individualism. But Jasmine was ready. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even blink. "What you call freedom," she said softly, "some of us have only experienced as collateral damage." The room paused, tilted. She continued, "You see, Mr. Carlson, there's a cost to the narratives you shape. When you peddled lies about a stolen election, people didn't just debate it online. They loaded their weapons, they boarded buses, they trampled police, they hung nooses, they died. And you, knowing it was false, laughed off the consequences because they were paid for by people whose names you never bothered to learn." Carlson tensed. "With all due respect," but Jasmine cut in, her voice steel. "No, not with all due respect. With all due evidence. With transcripts. With videos. With grieving families. With communities still recovering. You speak of freedom as if it exists in a vacuum. But you have never had to wake up and wonder if someone with your face, your last name, your accent, would be the next headline. Shot, silenced, or slandered, because someone believed a lie you helped sell." Carlson's smirk returned, but weaker now. "You're turning this into a morality play," he said. "You've left the facts and entered the theater. The courtroom became a stage the second you turned this into a crusade." She leaned forward, voice lower. "And you've mistaken performance for principle your entire career." He blinked, hard. Jasmine continued, "You want to talk about the real America? Let's talk about it. Your America is one of rugged individuals who answer to no one. Mine is of communities who have never been given the benefit of the doubt. You speak of liberty like it's a birthright. I speak of it like a debt, unpaid and accumulating interest with every generation that's told to wait." Carlson clenched his hands, a flash of annoyance slipping past his carefully curated image. "You're here because of the liberal media machine," he fired. "Let's not pretend otherwise. You're a headline wrapped in skin. You are the product of narrative warfare." The insult echoed. Reporters jolted. A few murmurs rippled across the hearing chamber. But Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She rose, fully, deliberately, without theatrics, only gravity. "You're right," she said. "I am a product, but not of the left. I am the product of justice denied. I am what happens when people are told to wait their turn for 400 years. I am what rises when silence fails. I am not here to be palatable. I am not here to perform. I am here to collect what this country has owed my people since the first lie was told in its founding documents, that liberty is universal while its application remains selective." She paused just long enough to let that settle, then continued, voice deeper, not louder. "You say you fight for freedom, but tell me, freedom for whom? For those who already have platforms? Or for those still shouting from the margins just to be seen?" She turned slightly, addressing the room now. "Not Carlson, not the committee, but the country. You think I'm dangerous because I'm angry, but I'm not angry. I'm focused, because I know what's at stake when people mistake freedom for immunity. When men with microphones forget that words are not toys, they are weapons. And you, Mr. Carlson, have left them on every kitchen table in America, unlocked, loaded, and pointed inward." Carlson had gone pale. Even the committee chair had leaned back in his seat, hands clasped tightly under his chin. Jasmine finished the thought, not for applause, but for history. "You think you're the truth teller in the room," she said, "but truth doesn't need to be the loudest voice. It needs to be the most accountable." A full minute passed before anyone moved. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate, unsure whether to zoom or hold their breath. Tucker Carlson opened his mouth, but for once nothing came out. But as the silence in the chamber deepened, the outside world erupted. Because in the age of digital reckoning, justice doesn't wait for verdicts. It trends. Within minutes of Jasmine's words echoing through the Capitol, a different storm surged outside the chamber walls. Twitter lit up like a battlefield, hashtags firing off with the urgency of protest chants. Crockett crushes, Carlson rocketed to the top of U.S. trends, closely followed by free speech under fire, the rallying cry of Tucker's loyalists. Screens across the country split in two. On one side, praise for a woman who had finally forced accountability into a room built to avoid it. On the other, fury from those who believed the great silencing had arrived. TikToks were clipped. Threads dissected every glance, every smirk, every pause. The internet had chosen its arena, and the world was now watching in real time, judging not just the testimony, but the character of its speakers. Back in the chamber, Tucker Carlson felt it. Not through his phone, he hadn't touched it in over an hour, but in the way the room's temperature had shifted. It was in the stiffness of his jaw, in the way his fingers now tapped faster than before against the lacquered wood. His composure, once impervious, began to show hairline fractures. The smirk was gone. The practiced ease of a man used to controlling the narrative had curdled into something less certain, something like dread. For the first time, he wasn't broadcasting a confrontation. He was trapped inside one. Chairman Redding cleared his throat. "Let's return to the matter of direct involvement," he said, flipping a page with clinical intent. "Mr. Carlson, please explain your role in approving the editorial content related to Dominion voting systems during the period of November to December 2020. Specifically, any on-air language you personally altered or authorized, and how it may have deviated from internal legal advisories." Tucker leaned into the mic, voice tense. "I'm not an executive. I wasn't the final filter. Like any anchor, I worked within the framework I was given. Segment outlines were approved." Jasmine cut in. "Yet your name appears on no less than 12 emails where you personally rejected fact-checking language proposed by legal counsel. One email dated November 14th states, and I quote, 'If we soften it now, we lose them. If we lose them, we lose everything.' That's not editorial review. That's strategy. So I ask again, were you acting as a journalist or as a brand manager for outrage?" Tucker's mouth tightened. "Context matters," he replied, but his voice cracked, just slightly. "I was protecting editorial independence." "Editorial independence from your own legal department?" Jasmine asked, the corner of her lip barely lifting. "Interesting definition." He shifted in his seat, adjusted his tie. The facade of absolute control, so carefully constructed, was now visibly strained. The questions were no longer abstract. They were forensic, and Jasmine delivered each one with the slow, cold clarity of someone who had walked defendants into corners for a living. She laid out more evidence. Documents showing coordinated narratives between Tucker's producers and far-right influencers. Slack messages from his staff mocking Dominion while scripting segments about its dangerous influence. Audio clips where fact checks were deliberately stripped because it'll kill the engagement. Each piece of evidence was a blow, not dramatic, not loud, but precise. A methodical dismantling of the empire he had built atop the illusion of credibility. Tucker's face reddened. His breathing had changed. He kept reaching for his pen, not to write, but to do something with his hands. Anything. A man once fluent in provocation was now caught in a language he no longer controlled. But Jasmine never raised her voice. She didn't need to. She sat upright, poised, her rhythm slow, relentless. Like cross-examination in a courtroom where there's only one real witness, the truth. "You've claimed repeatedly," she said, turning another page without breaking eye contact, "that your platform was about amplifying voices the mainstream ignored. But what happens when that megaphone gets pointed in the wrong direction? When it becomes a weapon, not a warning?" Her voice lowered, not with softness, but with weight. "Did you ever stop to consider who would get hurt? Not metaphorically, not in comment sections, but in real life, in ballot boxes, in courtrooms, on Capitol steps. Did you ever think beyond the camera?" Carlson opened his mouth, but she cut him off again, gently but firmly. "No, because the camera was enough, because the applause was enough, and the danger, that belonged to someone else." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was waiting for collapse or confession. Chairman Redding spoke next. Mr. Carlson, would you like to respond on the record to the materials just presented? Carlson gripped the sides of his chair. This is a show trial, he said finally, his voice thinner than before. You're crucifying me for making people uncomfortable, for giving them an alternative narrative when institutions failed them. Jasmine didn't flinch. No, Mr. Carlson, you're not being crucified for telling the truth. You're being questioned for monetizing lies. And discomfort isn't the issue. Disinformation is. Twitter erupted again. Crockett crushes. Carlson hit 3 million uses in under 2 hours. The phrase was no longer just a trend. It was a headline, a meme, a t-shirt design. The hashtag wasn't just commentary. It had become evidence that something irreversible had just occurred. Inside the chamber, Jasmine remained still. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't smirking. Her work wasn't about virality. It was about accountability. She knew the cameras would fade, the platforms would move on. But somewhere, right now, a school civics teacher was downloading this hearing for her students. A voter in Michigan was replaying the clip. A young black girl in Louisiana was watching and whispering, "That's what power looks like when it remembers where it came from." Tucker, meanwhile, had gone quiet again. His face had hardened, not with arrogance, but with calculation. He knew what was coming next. More exhibits, more questions, more hours under the surgical precision of a woman who never flinched because she had lived through storms far louder than him. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett never wavered, never stumbled. She sat like a former prosecutor, like the child of a movement, like the echo of justice long denied, but no longer delayed. And as the weight of truth began crushing the last defenses of spectacle, Jasmine didn't reach for triumph. She reached for precision, for clarity, the kind that leaves no room for denial and no air for escape. Jasmine Crockett remained standing, arms at her side, chin level, her voice a controlled tremor of resolve. The room was still, but it wasn't quiet. Not really. Silence had become something else entirely now. Not a pause, but a pressure, a countdown. Everyone in the chamber felt it, that unmistakable pull when something irreversible is about to be said. Jasmine turned slightly toward Tucker Carlson, not with vengeance, not with heat, but with the brutal calm of someone who had carried the truth too long to speak it softly anymore. "You call it media," she said, voice clear, stripped of ornament. "I call it the weaponization of lies." The words dropped like a gavel in slow motion. No one breathed. No one blinked. The overhead lights seemed to hum louder in the silence. Cameras froze in mid-zoom, as if even the machines knew this wasn't content. This was consequence. Tucker didn't move. Not yet. His hands, which had spent the morning gesturing, flipping, deflecting, now clenched the edge of the table. He had no answer. Not because he lacked one, but because nothing he could say would survive the sound of what had just been spoken. Chairman Redding looked down at the folder in front of him, then back to the panel. His voice, when it came, was somber, almost reluctant. "The Committee on Oversight and Accountability recommends that the full record of today's hearing be referred to the Department of Justice," he said slowly, like the words themselves required effort. "Specifically for investigation into the willful dissemination of knowingly false information with intent to incite harm, undermine democratic process, or profit from deception in violation of federal broadcast standards and civil harm statutes." He glanced around the room, not for consensus, but confirmation that everyone understood what had just happened. The panel nodded, one by one. Not theatrically, not eagerly, but in grim recognition. This wasn't a political win. This was the moment the air changed, the moment the machinery of justice, slow, imperfect, overdue, finally stirred beneath its dust and moved. Tucker's chair creaked as he finally stood. No dramatic protest, no exit line, no final attempt to reframe the moment for cable reruns. His face, once elastic with smugness, had collapsed into stone. He looked at Jasmine once, just once, but there was nothing in his eyes now. No contempt, no fury, only absence. The look of a man who had spent years narrating every room he walked into, and now had no voice in the one that would define him. He walked out without a word. The door clicked shut behind him like the end of an era. Inside the chamber, no one applauded. No one cheered. Jasmine sat down the same way she had entered, steady, silent, and alone. Because justice, when it finally arrives, isn't loud. It doesn't dance. It doesn't pose for headlines. It simply is. Across the country, news alerts lit up phones. Carlson referred to DOJ, they read. Crockett delivers final blow. Some headlines praised, others panicked. On social media, the war intensified. There's Crockett crushes. Carlson merged with the truth, it's not treason. Hashtags turned into declarations. The hearing was clipped, dissected, live-streamed to millions who had never watched a full congressional session before in their lives. But Jasmine wasn't watching the screens. In the small, private holding room behind the chamber, she stood alone at the window, watching the rain smear itself against Capitol glass. Her hands were still, her jaw tense. Not with pride, but with memory, because she remembered what it took to get here. The years in underfunded courtrooms, the angry emails, the threats, the locked doors and whispered warnings. She remembered being told, more times than she could count, that calling out power too directly was a career risk. That truth was best served with a smile and a softer tone. But today, she hadn't smiled, and the truth had been sharp. Behind her, an aide entered the room with a tablet. They're saying it's the most watched hearing in years, he said softly. Over 12 million views and counting. She didn't turn around. Then I hope someone heard the parts that mattered, she said. Not just the ones that trended. The aide hesitated. You think DOJ will really act? Jasmine finally looked over her shoulder. I think we gave them no place to hide. Outside, journalists swarmed the Capitol steps. Some were shouting questions. Others were just waiting, hoping to catch the first image of a man who had made a fortune telling America what to fear. Now facing something he could no longer spin. But Carlson never returned. And Jasmine didn't need to chase the cameras. Because sometimes, power isn't in the performance. It's in the stillness after the reckoning. In the moment, the lie collapses under the weight of its own repetition, and silence finally tells the truth. The echo of the hearing still hung in the chamber, like smoke after a controlled detonation. But Jasmine knew history doesn't end with silence. It only pauses to take a breath. The doors of the chamber creaked open, not with thunder, but with the quiet authority of aftermath. Jasmine Crockett stepped through them into a hallway flooded with white marble light, her heels clicking like clockwork on the stone polished by generations of footsteps. Most of them male, most of them indifferent. The corridor didn't cheer, it didn't erupt. But scattered among the aides and observers, a handful of people stood. A few clapped, not for show, not for spectacle, but as if they couldn't help themselves, as if they had just seen something rupture and weren't sure if it would ever be rebuilt again. A security guard nodded at her, the kind of nod that says everything and nothing. A law student on the sidelines clutched a notebook to her chest, eyes wide with reverence and questions she didn't yet know how to ask. And then, cutting through the stillness, a voice, young, cracking slightly, like it had rehearsed this moment in the mirror. You made me believe, said the student, that the truth can still win. Jasmine stopped. Just for a moment. She turned, and the weight of the day, the decades behind it, the centuries behind that, flashed for a heartbeat in her eyes. Then she gave the student the only thing that mattered, not a soundbite, not a smile, but a steady gaze and a single nod that said, don't stop, because they won't. And then she walked on. Outside, the press was already splitting at the seams. Microphones shoved forward. Headlines flashed across digital tickers. Jasmine crushes, Carlson blared across liberal feeds. Freedom on trial blinked on conservative screens. Commentators screamed into split screens, voices growing hoarse before the sun could even begin to set. On the evening news, anchors debated whether Jasmine was the conscience America had waited for, or the censor it feared. Hero, heretic, defender, destroyer. Every angle was fighting to define her. None of them had asked who she was. By nightfall, her face had been photoshopped onto Lady Liberty and Stalin in equal measure. But Jasmine wasn't watching. Her SUV pulled up quietly behind the Capitol steps. She climbed in without a word, the door shutting behind her like the final period on a book she had been forced to write in real time. The city glowed outside the tinted glass. Sirens somewhere in the distance. A protest forming near the National Mall. Someone had already spray-painted her name on the concrete wall outside the courthouse. Crockett spoke for us. She said nothing. The car wound through DC's arteries like a ghost, finally pulling up outside a small government building with no press, no flashbulbs, just gray stone and quiet resolve. Her office. Inside, the lights were off. The silence was heavier here, not from judgment, but from exhaustion. She walked past her desk without slowing, toward the filing cabinet at the back of the room, the one marked only by an etched brass plaque. Hearings, active and pending. She unlocked the top drawer, the sound of the key turning, breaking the hush like a match striking steel. Slowly, methodically, she reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. Thick, sealed, labeled with a name that hadn't yet hit the headlines. Another figure, another lie, another system weaponizing silence. She placed it in the drawer, top shelf, and for a long moment, she didn't move. She just stood there, the woman who had brought down one of the most powerful media personalities in the country, with nothing but her voice, her discipline, and her refusal to blink, staring at the next battle already waiting. This is what justice looks like when it doesn't rest. This is what it costs when you win. And no, it isn't over. She closed the drawer, locked it, and exhaled once, quietly through her nose, not like a sigh, but like a recalibration, a return to center. And as she turned off the light and walked back into the night, she didn't look back. Because Jasmine Crockett wasn't finished. She was just getting started. And when the doors closed behind her and the cameras finally turned away, what remained wasn't the noise, but the question echoing in every hallway of power. What do we do with truth once it's been spoken out loud? The lesson isn't just about law. It isn't even just about power. It's about something harder to hold and even harder to restore once it's been shattered. Trust. Jasmine Crockett didn't walk into that hearing room to become a symbol. She walked in because, for too long, truth had been treated like a guest in its own house, welcomed when convenient, silenced when profitable. The cost of her voice wasn't just criticism, it was isolation. It was knowing that every word would be dissected, twisted, reframed, not by those who misunderstood her, but by those who understood her perfectly and feared what her clarity could dismantle. And yet she spoke, because that's what courage looks like in a country where silence is often rewarded, and truth is penalized at scale. The injustice she faced wasn't a new villain in an old courtroom. It was older than the building itself. It was systemic, surgical, invisible until someone held it up to the light and dared to name it. Every time Jasmine asked a question that cut too deep, she wasn't just confronting a man, she was confronting a machine, a system that had learned how to turn disinformation into income, fear into fuel, and spectacle into sovereignty. And when she refused to flinch, she broke more than a witness. She broke the rhythm of letting the loudest define reality, the rhythm of allowing power to wear a smile while it empties truth of meaning. But this isn't a fairy tale. Jasmine's story doesn't end with applause or comfort, because real justice doesn't come gift-wrapped. It arrives with bloodshot eyes, lonely rides home, and headlines that call you both a hero and a threat, sometimes on the same day. The human lesson in her story isn't about a victory, it's about endurance. The kind of endurance that ordinary people carry when they fight systems designed to outlast them. The kind of endurance that says, I will speak even if it changes nothing, because silence has already changed too much. There's something deeply American about the collision between Crockett and Carlson, not because of the spectacle, but because of the paradox. One used speech to manipulate, the other used silence to shatter it. One believed freedom meant immunity from responsibility. The other believed it meant being accountable to something larger than yourself. And in that clash, we're left with a haunting question. What happens when a nation confuses noise with truth and ratings with righteousness? Jasmine's confrontation teaches us that truth is no longer enough to win. It must be armed, structured, delivered with the precision of law and the resilience of those who have nothing left to lose. In today's world, truth doesn't whisper, it has to roar. And even when it roars, it still might be drowned out. But it must still try. Because when we give up on that fight, we surrender the only weapon that doesn't leave blood behind. But there's another lesson here. Quieter, deeper. Jasmine didn't just defeat a man, she reminded a generation what it looks like when someone carries pain without letting it poison them. She reminded us that poise is not the absence of fury, but the discipline to wield that fury with purpose. That integrity isn't the performance of goodness. It's the refusal to compromise when no one is watching. That every courtroom, every hearing, every moment of confrontation is a chance, not to win, but to make meaning. And meaning is what our democracy is dying for. Her final act, placing another file into that cabinet, wasn't just procedural, it was symbolic. Justice doesn't sleep, not because it's noble, but because it's never finished. In a country drowning in narratives, people like Jasmine remind us that evidence still matters, that arguments can still be sharp without being cruel, that leadership doesn't require perfection, only presence, discipline, and the willingness to be hated in the service of truth. So what do we take from this? We take the reminder that truth doesn't protect itself. It requires people, risk, fire, sacrifice. It requires someone to stand up, even if they know the blowback will come 10 times harder. It requires someone to sit across from power, stare it in the eye and say, not today, not this time. Jasmine Crockett did that, quietly, brutally, without blinking. And in doing so, she didn't just reveal what one man had done. She reminded the rest of us what one woman, unbought, unbroken, and unafraid, still can. But stories like Jasmine Crockett's don't end at the courthouse steps. They begin there, because truth alone doesn't change the world. People do. So now the question turns to you, not as a spectator, not as someone scrolling headlines, but as someone living in the very world that allowed this story to happen. What will you do with what you just saw? Will you let it fade into another forgotten hearing, another clipped soundbite buried under the next scandal? Or will you carry it, not just in your memory, but in your actions? Because injustice doesn't rest, and silence will always be the cheapest ally of power. Jasmine stood alone so others wouldn't have to. She didn't need your applause. She needed your echo, your voice, your vote, your willingness to question, to challenge, to fight back, not with noise, but with clarity. And the next time someone tells you that truth is subjective, that power cannot be held accountable, that one voice can't make a difference, remember this, it already did. So don't just watch, don't just repost, stand, speak. Ask the hard questions in your classroom, in your newsroom, in your dinner table debates. Refuse to let comfort become complicity. Refuse to let power go unchecked because it's louder or better funded. Refuse to believe that justice is someone else's job. Because Jasmine wasn't the first, and if we're lucky, she won't be the last. But the distance between her courage and your silence is where injustice survives. Close it. Close it now. Before another lie finds its stage. Before another truth dies in the dark. Before the next hearing is about you, and no one is left to speak your name. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.